That's the name of my book, Man Overboard, a Medical Lifeline for the Aging Male. I was fortunate enough to get it published by Mayo Clinic Press. And of course, having their name on any medical book has been, is a real help. But I'll start with a little bit of my story. Some of you, I think, know it. So I graduated from Batavia High School in 1983. Batavia is up in one of the suburbs of Chicago, out by St. Charles, Geneva, Batavia, Aurora, that sort of group, Elgin. This picture, I submit this picture because it shows you the ravages of aging and reminds me of the author Philip Roth quote, aging isn't a battle, it's a massacre. After Batavia, I went to Augustana College. Down by Illinois, you say Augustana, everybody kind of knows what you're talking about, but up here in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, there's one in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So you have to be specific. You have to say Augustana, Sioux Falls. So this is over in Rock Island. I was a pre-med major, but in my freshman year, my English professor, Dr. Karen Youngberg, asked me to show up in her office. She needed to talk to me. I thought I was in trouble. And she kind of wanted to, she said, well, what's your major? And I said, pre-med. And she like rolled her eyes, because whatever, 95% of freshmen were pre-med. So she said, well, I really like your writing and I think you should be an English major and here's why. And so she bore some resemblance to my mother and I was 19 and I just did what she told me. So I became a English major pre-med. I did some writing on campus. They have a literary magazine. I wrote a few things for them and senior year got one of their awards for a short story. But that was the gist of it. I didn't really have any more plans than that. So in 1987, I went to SIU. That was a very, very long time ago. This was the logo at the time. You might be surprised to know the logo was designed by Abe Lincoln. It was that long ago. Now, of course, the logo is much, much more modern. And I kind of like it. It has kind of a nice pizzazzy look. So to refresh your memory, 1987, many, many years ago at the time, polio was just coming out. Here I am with a couple of my comrades using one of the first oral polio vaccines to a patient. At the time, the surgery they weren't doing laparoscopic surgery, but were doing surgery in the round. And of course, nurses wore hats. That was important for them to wear hats. And then so I graduated in 1991. Here's our graduation photo. I know it's grainy, but at the time, that's the best we had. So at the end of med school, I was a little flummoxed about what to do next. It was not a complete breakdown, but I felt like I was just overeducated at that point. I came from blue collar roots and I just felt like I needed 8 years of college and medical school. I just felt like my brain was full. And so I moved to, actually, I think I'm sure I wrote this, but in our graduation book for our class, I wrote that I was, everyone was saying like, I'm going to do my surgery residency here or my whatever residency here. And I didn't have that. So I wrote that I was going to be a Deal-A-Meal rep for Richard Simmons in Minneapolis. Fortunately, my parents didn't panic. So I moved to Minneapolis. For those of you who wonder, where is Minnesota? I think that's an honest question. I hope this map answers it for you. We're the one in yellow. We're part of America's North Coast, I like to say. And if you need more clues, we brought you Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox, Prairie Companion, Dairy Queen, Bob Dylan, Prince, inline skates, roller skates, and Nordic Track. So you can be grateful for that. And also Medtronic and 3M and General Mills and Betty Crocker and Pillsbury and a whole bunch of other things. So that's what Minnesota can do for you. So I came up here and I joined a friend who was getting an MBA at the University of Minnesota. So we roomed together up in what's called Northeast they don't say north up here. They say northeast, northeast Minneapolis, which is kind of a hip place to live now. It wasn't at the time. Uh, Serendipitously, the couple that was living below us were both residents in internal medicine, and I was thinking primary care. I hadn't really decided, and but I wanted to go someplace to kind of go to keep my head in the game. I took this year off. So they said, well, yeah, come on. We're both residents at this place, Abbott Northwestern. It's an internal medicine program, private hospital. Come down, you can do grand rounds there. So I did show up and eventually ended up going through their residency. So I was there, did 3 years, 92 to 95, and then I was there for as a chief. And then shortly after I finished my chief year, I started thinking about writing. And I started in some small kind of, entertainment newspapers around town. One was called the Twin Cities Reader, City Pages, that kind of thing. Wrote a few things for them, blogged a little bit, and then got a column with Minnesota Monthly, which is a magazine still around. It's loosely affiliated with Minnesota Public Radio. The editor at the time had been at Iowa's Writers Workshop, so it was a very literate magazine, and he just said, like, hey, would you want to do a monthly column? And so it seemed like that easy. In fact, it was so easy that the very first magazine I was in put me on the cover, which I thought, like, I never thought I would be like, the never end up being the mayor of a major town in India, and I never thought that I would end up being on the cover. But he said, like, hey, we don't have a cover idea. We like your piece on Atkins diet. Would you want to be on the cover? Oddly enough, and not surprisingly, that did not do anything for my modeling career. So I did that for 3 years. It was really fun. I kind of wrote to whatever I was interested. I did everything. I did serious things. I did one time the Broadway play Urinetown was coming to Minneapolis, and so I wrote a column on urine. Who's ever written a column just about urine? I did pieces on hemorrhoids, but I did pieces on high blood pressure. It kind of was sort of, I joke, I did everything from croup to nuts. And it was really fun, but it was a once a month thing. And I had I was continuing to work. So I was looking for other things. So I joined minpost.com. This picture, I think, is kind of my Vladimir Lenin picture. I think I look remarkably similar to Vladimir Lenin. I would have preferred John Lennon. So I wrote for them for a number of years. By the way, Minpost is basically filled with expats from our two major newspapers who went through a lot of shrinkage like every other. And then a friend of mine at work, who was a well-known writer, Ron Glasser, he wrote a book called 365 Days that was on the National Book Award list. He knew, he says, hey, I know, what's her name now? The woman who started Huffington Post, Ariana Huffington. I know her. You want her phone number? I'm like, yeah, sure. So he gives me her number, and I call it, and an aide answers, and she says, well, she's busy right now, but just leave her a message and we'll get you. So anyhow, I started blogging for the Huffington Post blog, and this is pretty early in the thing. Most of the stuff I did with medical. Here is a piece that I wrote called Annex the Baja. After the Winter Olympics, and Russia annexed Crimea. And so my idea was like, well, why don't we just retaliate by annexing the Baja? Because it's quite naturally, when you look at it, the Baja is much more naturally part of the United States than it is Mexico. And probably there's probably more Americans living in the Baja than there are Mexicans. That did not launch my political career. Just like my being on the cover did not launch my modeling career. What probably did move me to another kind of step was this friend, Ron Glasser, knew one of the editors of the Washington Post. He said, you should get a hold of him. I talked to him a little bit. And he said, like, I didn't have any pedigree. I wasn't a faculty at any medical school or anything like that. but he said, like, so write something from your, I want something from your shoes, take me to what you're doing. That's the thing that people want to read. So I was riding my bike to work. It was in the fall, and there's a lot of nice houses on this boulevard that I'm on. And one of them, the lawns are all going brown, but one of them had a lawn sprinkler going. And I just looked and I'm like, well, you can sprinkle your lawn all you want this time of year, but until the sun comes back, it's never going to be green. And it just sort of in my head, sort of like, I just laughed to myself, well, that's kind of what a lot of what I do at work is. Sometimes I feel like I'm just watering the lawn in November. And so I wrote this piece about end of life care in the hospital. I kind of knew at the time you could get yourself talking about end of life, you might get yourself in the trouble that people might want to put you in the Kevorkian camp. But I wrote it and I was not at all prepared for, it was on the front of Outlook, which is the Washington Post Sunday opinion section. I was working that day and I just kind of peeked at my email and 150, 300, 425, it just like, by the end of it, I had like several thousand emails, and suddenly, I'd become an expert on the end of life. Fortunately, I was overwhelmed by the number of people who wrote empathetically to me and shared at length in great detail their struggles with their family members and how they felt like the medical system, they were advocating for a peaceful, painless death. And the medical system said, no, you don't. I was overwhelmed. There was one negative letter, and someone wrote to the ombudsman and said, obviously I hate old people. And of course, I thought that was funny because I shouldn't have been an internist. If I hate old people, I should have been a pediatrician. 3 years later, I wrote what was a second piece, which I would say was a kind of a bookend to this initial piece. I think the initial piece was sort of like what was happening in the hospital, what I was seeing, and then this piece was sort of like an explanation, I think, for kind of why I thought it was happening, what forces were at work to kind of keep us from denying the thing that would be denied, and that was actually, I think, even more popular than the first one, to my surprise. So it opened up a lot of opportunities to write. I ended up going to speaking at the United Press Club in Washington. I was in the Leonard Fillmore room, so it was not one of the big presidents, but it was an honor nevertheless. And there was a point there, and I did a bunch of speaking on that topic, but I kind of realized that, and I think at that time, if I wanted to, I could have pivoted to being an end of life, sort of advocate expert, but it's not what I wanted to do. I don't know. That's serious work, and I don't know if I had the aptitude for just being that. So I kind of, in some sense, sort of walked away from that. After that, I ended up writing, more like freelance stuff. As any of you have kids, the kids, by the time the kids got in the junior high in particular and high school, it was like, I knew that we wouldn't have them all that much longer. So I spent a lot more time kind of hanging out, and I wrote less. But I wrote for Slate and Forbes and Next Avenue, and I've written a lot of stuff for things for Kevin MD and that kind of stuff. And then I decided to write a book, and it just sort of, I don't know, why write a men's health book. Part of it, I think, was I'm an aging male myself, so part of it was from my own self. The book is sort of definitely in my magazine style, not in a journalistic style. It's very much, I'm in there. So part of it was for me. Part of it, I think, is honestly, I think there's something inherently funny about the aging male. Something, I don't know if any of you are into Monty Python, but there's this, in Search of the Holy Grail, there's a famous scene where they come upon the Black Knight, and the Black Knight says, "None shall pass." And they have this duel, and Lancelot slashes off the Black Knight's one leg, and you think, well, that's over. And the Black Knight says, "Come on, you sissy." And then they fight a little bit and he slashes off the other leg. And then it's definitely like, okay, battle over. And the Black Knight is just spewing venom, saying, "Come on, you sissy, it's not over." And I started watching that when I was in my mid-20s, but the older I got, the more I sort of realized that, that is that is the aging male, the sort of satirical, bombastic, "I'm fine because I've been fine, and so I'll continue to be fine" sort of thing. So I I kind of put this book together, shopped it around. I got a lot of people saying like, "Oh, I love your idea. It's a really idea and it'll never sell. Sorry." And then I found a literary agent. Actually, she found me, which is a little unusual I'll make it quick, but what's interesting about when you're a writer, you're in the opposite position of when you're a doctor. When you're a doctor, everybody wants to get a hold of you all day, just, "Can you talk to me? Can you answer my page?" All that stuff. When you're a writer, you're on the other end of that. You're just trying to get 10 seconds of an editor's time. "Can you just please read this email? I'll keep it really short and to the point. Tell me yes or no." When you're trying to shop a book or find a literary agent, you're on the other side of that. So it's in that way, a very humorous society. Like, they're super busy. They're hard to get a hold of. Anyhow, the agent found me. Eventually, as I understand it, Mayo Clinic decided that they wanted to get into the trade business, and rather than doing things that were more formally academic, they wanted to try to do stuff that were more trade books, and so they hired me. So over the course of a year or so, I'd written a lot of it, but I worked with a couple of different editors. I think I handed in the final copy maybe the end of June, and then on October 18th, it came out. Of course, I joke that the book is scientifically formulated, to speak to men, but the truth of the matter is there's a lot of the chapters are unisex and appropriate for unisexuals. So, chapters on nutrition, exercise, low back pain, a lot of them are both. And actually, the first permutation of the first working title was "Nut Job: A Woman's Guide to the Aging Male," which in some ways still is my favorite because everybody gets it. You don't really have to explain it. Like, "Oh, I get that," because I think in the end, a lot of the medical decisions in the family are made by women. Oftentimes I think they kind of inherit that job because they're in charge of the kids' health, and so they end up taking care of the husband's health. And then even after the kids leave, like, the kids are gone, why am I caring for you? It's time to, take care of yourself, kind of thing. So it's up on Amazon.com, and then Mayo Clinic Press has its own website and also its own distribution, so it's available there. And it's been, I've been doing some of this stuff is kind of unfamiliar to me, but it seems like in general podcasts have replaced book signings, in part because it was already going that way, but also because of COVID. So doing podcasts and radio and that sort of stuff. I think the best way to give you a kind of a sense just for what it's about is just to show you the contents. And I'll just read you a few, I guess. Chapter 1, Andropause: The age of getting things done, unquote, begs the shadowy question, is it low T? Testosterone tales, the transformative powers of the Y chromosome and the complex world of sex hormones. Great sexpectations, clapping on, clapping off, erectile dysfunction, and the rise of the pecker power industry, which a lot of us, Cassie, sorry, you probably didn't see this, but boy, in the early 2008s, it started with Bob Dole, and these ED ads were everywhere, as were low T ads, and they kind of basically, to my view, just hilariously satirized the aging male. So I in some ways, I sort of enjoyed them. Of course, the chapter on balding, I have some personal experience. You may notice bald is beautiful, but is it unhealthy? Is hair loss a disease or a condition? And what to do or not to do about it. low back pain. I do a little bit of poetry, including the Smokers Amalgamated Sinners and Serenity Prayer. So I basically combine the Sinner's Prayer and the Serenity Prayer to make a Smoker's Prayer. I did a chapter on vices, caffeine, smoking, alcohol, marijuana, CBD, that kind of stuff. Chapter on sleep, a chapter on nutrition, which I'm really kind of proud of. I think it's, gosh, there's books and books and books written about this. So nutrition, how we went cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Of course, a chapter on weight and obesity, Supersized Nation, a chapter on Move It or Lose It, and particularly this thing championed by James Levine, who used to be at Mayo, a thing called NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So basically looking at, how does just staying active prevent weight loss? A thing on exercise, rise up our pathletes. I haven't heard from AARP. I was kind of hoping they'd sue my ass off and we get a bunch of publicity. Haven't heard from them. Sexercise. That answers the question. Remember the ads were always about ask your doctor if you're healthy enough to have sex. That was actually originally in Slate. Risky Business, which is kind of just basically an introduction to the rest of the book. I kind of say like, hey, having a fear-focused approach to disease is not a bad idea because your fears should be based on your risks. So the second half of the book talks about number one and number two, cancer and heart disease. So there's a chapter on heart disease, a chapter on heart disease prevention, a chapter, kind of introductory chapter on cancer, the big C, and then of course the big three for men: lung cancer, colorectal cancer, and prostate cancer. A chapter on mental health, which I'm also proud of. I might read a little bit from that, called Mind Games. Mental health finally gets its due. Turns out everyone struggles, some more, some less. And then a final chapter, you're going to live forever, and I'm going to learn how to fly. Theories on aging. I thought, what I do next, if any of you are still awake, read a couple of short segments. Would that be okay? Everybody up for that? Yes? No? Speak now or forever hold your peace. So this is from the, well, actually, I'll read, this is, I don't do too much poetry, but it starts out with a poem, and it's so quick, I'll read it. It's called Song for the Aging Male. Throwing off the shackles of youth, I reach for the stars and pull the hip flexor. Damn it. So, what you'll discover in the following pages is that I am a medical centrist. That's because, generally speaking, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. You don't want high blood pressure but you don't want low blood pressure either. Right in the middle is good. You want a strong heart, but if it gets too muscular, it gets stiff, and then it doesn't work right. Thyroid function, middle, please. Too much, and you get wired up like a meth addict without the dental issues. Too little, and you start to feel cold, slow, and pudgy. On one extreme of personal health, you have the neurotically health obsessed. Every facet of life, every food choice, every moment of activity, every guilty pleasure is either adding to or removing seconds from life. Every symptom must be pursued as a warning sign that will allow them to take action. But every piece of health information can also be perceived as just one more way to die. And these people often end up worried sick, sometimes literally. Sure, it's possible that all that effort will allow them to live longer, but how much longer? And will they even enjoy it? On the other extreme of personal health is just straight up denial, sometimes referred to as testosterone blindness or testosterone poisoning. Equal parts stoicism, nihilism, and good old-fashioned fear. This is the feeling that a guy can be completely healthy as long as he doesn't go to the doctor. We won't give him diabetes, high blood pressure, or prostate cancer. I was perfectly fine when I walked in the clinic door, but I am fine because I have been fine, and so I will continue to be fine is not a legitimate medical self-evaluation. And delaying care generally just leads to bigger problems. I get it. I hate going to the doctor too. I treat shopping and healthcare like a special ops mission, a high-risk venture pursued only out of great necessity with a sense of urgency. You get in there, get what you need, and get the hell out. If I could get a chopper to extricate me, I would. Extraction point, Cinnabon, upper level of the food court. So I try to, the book I think is sort of I am kind of a medical centrist, or what politically I call myself a radical moderate, because I just find myself usually in the middle. That's kind of the intro. I thought I'd read something, just the beginning of the nutrition chapter, because I hope you'll agree with me. And I think you'll see it's kind of talks about our training. So nutrition, how we went cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. The low-fat craze left us gobbling down carbs and fatter than ever. As a certified healthcare professional, I want to relay to you, the lay reader, the entire breadth and depth of the nutritional knowledge I've acquired through years of medical training. It goes like this. People need to eat. People eat by putting food in their pie hole, aka the mouth. If a person can't eat via the pie hole, a tube can be threaded down in the stomach so they can be fed that way. If it's impossible to slide a feeding tube down in their stomach, the tube can also be put in surgically through the abdominal wall. If that doesn't work, intravenous feedings can be used. When people eat too much, they get fat. When they don't eat enough, they get skinny. People should eat in a balanced way, with some of this, some of that, but not too much of this at the expense of that, or they'll end up imbalanced, and that's not good. What we're shooting for is balance. There you go. That's everything I learned about nutrition in 7 years of medical school and residency training. It also dovetailed nicely with what I learned from my high school health teacher, who was also the wrestling coach, although I didn't wrestle. He was a good guy, but his chain smoking habits made him a somewhat less than credible candidate for the job. We never saw him smoke, but his clothes exhaled like a bowling alley of yore. And he had the kind of voice that suggested his vocal cords had been charred beyond recognition by too many heaters. He was not the picture of health, but he taught it. The class itself was only slightly more complicated than driver's ed. What I think I remember him saying was something about how the crafty Egyptians erected the first food pyramids way back in the Wayback period. This made a deep impression on me, particularly when you think how healthy the ancient Egyptians looked as depicted in hieroglyphs. Very svelte, very slender, very healthy. From high school health to medical school and residency, the subliminal message was that nutrition wasn't an important part of health. If it was, we'd spend more time on it, you idiot. Is it possible to be yelled at subliminally? That view is supported by the National Board Exams, the series of tests that any board-certified doctor must pass. Those are tests that are generally devoid of any questions about human nutrition, but do have a lot of detailed questions about medical esoterica, such as parasitic conditions you might see if you're working in an urgent care in, let's say, central Senegal, but not anywhere else. Armed with this woeful lack of nutritional knowledge, doctors have two choices. The first would be to recognize that you, the all-knowing but really not knowing doctor, are backed up deep in your own territory. Time to bring out the punter. Simply tell the patient, you're overweight, you don't eat right. Would you like to see a dietitian? The second option for the nutritionally malnourished doctor is to educate him or herself on the subject, and this is what I chose. Encouraging me was the embarrassment of having a partner who knew more about nutrition than all of the diplomats of the American Board of Medical Specialties combined. And finally, this is kind of the most, I would say the most, in some ways the most autobiographical, but this is the beginning of the Mind Games chapter. I think a lot of you maybe will share this background as I did. Mind games, mental health finally gets its due. Turns out everyone struggles, some more, some less. I was born in 1965 in the land of Lincoln. My parents didn't have a parenting philosophy outside of go to school, be home by dinner, make something of yourself, and leave your brother alone. Although I felt deeply loved and cared for, it was a PB&J with apple and chips physical world. What you saw was all there was. School was reading, writing, and arithmetic. The teachers weren't there to raise our emotional IQ. Church was mostly about benevolence, the poor, the sick, the hungry, and redemption, how to avoid becoming extra crispy in the lake of fire. Only salvation can bring inner peace. Doubts, fears, worries, struggles were courtesy of the other guy, not God, and should be opposed by prayer. When it came to male role models, it appeared that action heroes and professional athletes were what I should be shooting for. Contemplative, introspective men like Gandhi, Henry David Thoreau, or Mr. Rogers were no match for steely men of action like John Wayne, James Bond, or Starsky and Hutch. The budding writer John Boy on the TV series The Waltons was the only male who seemed willing to wrestle with his innermost thoughts and feelings. Strange things happen in the hills of Appalachia. I was not emotionally suppressed as a boy, but if there were such things as emotions, it seemed as if girls got most of them. Like braids, long hair, jump rope, that was their thing. My father's father died in an accident when my dad was 8. I asked him a number of times how the tragic loss affected him. And the answer, I don't know, I was just a kid, always ended the conversation. His answer may have been a lie or a dodge, but I suspect it was simply the message he was given. Suck it up, stay strong, the usual bullshit young men were often reared on. With this emotional and inner life vacuum, the only people I knew who were experiencing mental illness were cooped up in a state mental hospital a couple of towns upriver from my hometown. It's an Elgin State Mental Hospital. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, just south of the interstate there. We rarely drove past its sprawling 1,000+ acre campus, but when we did, it was spooky. A collection of ancient brick buildings made it look like Dracula University. What did commencement look like? Capes over capes? The message was clear. Mental health applied to the insane and occurred at a distance to someone else. If you didn't grow up near a state mental hospital, and I'm guessing you didn't, then your only other exposure to mental health issues was probably through the TV or movies where deranged criminality sells. If serial killers such as the paranoid schizophrenic son of Sam, Jeffrey Dahmer with his borderline personality disorder were in short supply, we could count on Hollywood to fill the gap with characters like Hannibal Lecter, whose struggles with homicidal cannibalism were hardly meant to be a public service announcement for antisocial personality disorder. We were to be titillated and entertained. All of this had the effect of making relatively uncommon mental health diagnoses seem more like the norm and also far more criminal than they are. When in actuality, the most common health issues are mood disorders like anxiety and depression. The vast majority of those struggling with their mental health are not insisting that T-Mobile or the Pope or their long since dead high school English teacher is controlling the voices in their heads. They're wondering if they will ever feel like smiling again, or if the apparent calmness they see in others will ever be theirs. But here's the kicker. Everyone struggles with their mental health. It's just a matter of degrees. Although each year 1 in 5 adult Americans experience mental illness, and 1 in 20 will experience serious mental illness, the remaining 80% of the population isn't necessarily stuck on calm and happy. Our moods are not binary, like an on and off switch for a light, but more like lights on a dimmer switch. The light comes up and down, and it's not always clear who or what is in control. You don't need to have an official diagnosis of anxiety or depression to deal with the feelings of anxiety or depression. You only need to be human. So wherever one is on the mental health spectrum, it is nice to know something objective about the most subjective and abstract of things, our moods. So this is my family, my wife Steph, son Caleb, who just returned back home and is now a nurse on our the mental health ward where I work. Julia, our daughter, who's just started at Loyola in Chicago, and our oldest son Isaac, who is a freshman at Case Western in medical school. And then the old guy on the end, I don't recognize who that is. I think it's my father or an old man in the neighborhood that walked in. And then maybe more importantly, there's our dog. So that's probably more than you want to know about what I've been doing since I left Springfield, Illinois. But that's it.